Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this digital workshop on mental health and the challenges around suicide. We're pleased to be joined by this distinguished panel and our partner at Soul Shop Movement. We look forward to hearing from them over the next hour about some important topics. So I'm hopeful that you will engage. Please do enter where you are dialing in from into the chat, and so that everybody can get a sense of who might be online. And don't hesitate to post your questions or your comments into the chat feature. And if you are not a member of Episcopal Parish Network, we invite you to learn more about joining our work in presenting digital workshops like this through the links that I'm about to post into the welcome. And with all of that said, many thanks to our panel once again, and I'm turning it over to Michelle now.
Okay, Joe, how do I just do a screen share? Kind of lost you.
A screen share. You can just down at the bottom in the middle.
There we go. Okay, screen share. There we go. Can you see my power?
You are running. Yep. Just put it to presentation mode.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you. My name's Michelle Snyder, and I'm the co-director of the Soul Shop Movement, along with my partner, Christopher. We're also here with Reverend Marna Franson, who is in the Episcopal priest, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then Father Matt Holcomb from the Colorado Springs area. So every one of those folks are going to talk with you today about this topic of mental health, suicide, and what we know. So we are, I guess I should say that how we end up on this call is that we are Soul Shop, the Soul Shop Movement, and we do suicide prevention ministry. So my background is in, I've got a master's in divinity, a master's in social work, and have been a clinician for many, many years. And as a clinician, what I found is that I was being asked to field a lot related to suicide, and actually wasn't very well trained even as a clinician for how to deal with suicide. And so I don't start with the presumption that those of us in the field really know very much about this topic. But so just to kind of get our feet wet about mental health and suicide and why the church should care about this, why this is an issue in the church, some statistics that we find helpful to get everybody kind of up to speed about what's really going on out there in relationship to suicide. Is that suicide is the 12th leading cause of death in the United States. It used to be 10th, actually, and then COVID hit, and it got bumped to 12th as a result of COVID, but it's still a leading cause of death, a leading public health crisis in America. There are approximately 46,000 people who die every year by suicide. I believe that is the population of is it Boulder, Colorado? Does that sound right? I don't know. It's one of those Colorado towns that everybody's heard of. Might be Littleton, but anyway, it's a population of a major population center in Colorado. So about 46,000 people die by suicide every single year. It's the second leading cause of death for those between the ages of 10 and 34. So second only to accidents. It's the younger you are, the higher it goes. And I just read today that it's the eighth leading cause of death for white men in America. So it's a leading cause of death, particularly for young people. The rates of suicide have risen almost consistently for 30 years. We did see there was a slight dip in suicide rates during COVID for 2 years running. People thought they went up. They actually didn't. They went down. But other than that, suicide rates have steadily climbed every single year for 30 years, in spite of the fact that resources have been poured into this. And we've been having more and more conversation, in spite of the fact that there have been just major initiatives in this direction. They continue to rise. So currently what we see, they are again on the rise after COVID. We do see, when you break the data down, that they're going down slightly for Caucasians, while they're going up for Black communities, brown communities, Native communities. So minority communities are where the most rises in suicide are happening right now. As far as incidents and where they're coming from, 70% of suicides in America are middle-aged white men. We talk a lot about kids. We talk a lot about adolescents in relationship to suicide, but the reality is that most suicides are middle-aged white men. And 60% of those showed no major mental health issues. So we've got some misconceptions about the fact that suicide is a directly correlated to mental health issues. A 2022 study just showed that 60% of white men who died by suicide had no major mental health issues that were at least visible and obvious. The estimates are that 6% of adults and 17% of adolescents are thinking about suicide at any given time. We think that's a pretty significant number. I always say to pastors, if you're asking yourself, is there anyone in my church who's thinking about suicide? You're asking yourself the wrong question. In every room of 100 adults, you've got 6 of them statistically who are thinking about suicide. And anytime you've got a group of 20 kids that come together, about 20% of them are thinking about suicide. Actually, this 17% is an old number. On the other side of COVID, it's now 19. So almost 20% of adolescents are thinking about suicide. And then when we talk about suicide ministry, suicide prevention ministry, we always want to take into account those among us who are worried about someone that might be thinking about suicide, those who have lost someone to suicide. We call them survivors of suicide loss, and those who have lived experience of suicidal thinking. And when you take all of those kind of groups of people together, what we really end up with is more than 50% of a congregation that is impacted in some way by suicide. So when we talk about why the church should care about this issue, 46,000 people may mean that your church doesn't see a suicide in a year, or it might not see a suicide in 2 or 3 years. Maybe, knock on wood, you've never had one. But the reality is that whether or not you've lost someone in your congregation to suicide, people in your congregation are impacted by suicide. And the number of people who are thinking about it far surpass the number who actually attempt or die by suicide. As I said, suicide is not mostly, or at least singularly, an issue of mental illness. We hear people talk about suicide. When somebody dies, you'll hear somebody say, I didn't even know they were depressed. And it's a pretty common misconception that mental illness is a straight line, or people who die by suicide because they have some kind of mental illness. What's more true is suicide often, it is always, not often. Suicide is almost often about a complex mix of factors. We call them contributaries, and there's almost always multiple contributaries that are going on for people. So in addition to mental illness, there are other things like stress, stress related to financial problems, or trying to work multiple jobs and you still can't make ends meet, or legal pressure, or those kinds of things. So stress is a big one. Shame, for people who either feel shame about who they are or about something they've done. Shunning, because of being shunned because of bad choices that have been made. financial problems, identity crises, people who are trapped in situations they don't know how to get out of, relationship problems, domestic violence situations, firearms access, substance abuse. And that's just kind of a list that's right off the top of my head, that in addition to whatever kind of mental illness we're dealing with, these are some of the things that can be going on. And this is really important when we in churches, when we in the church start thinking about suicide. This is a really important point, because when we think that suicide is a mental health problem primarily, that it's a it's related to mental illness, it's pretty easy for us to pass it off as a clinical issue. It's pretty easy for us to say, I'm not a clinician, this is a clinical issue, and so this really isn't my problem, or I'm not equipped for it. But when we start to realize that these other things are going on for folks, then it brings the church back into the mix, because there are ways that we can be a part of the solution. One of our favorite quotes in relationship to suicide is this. This is a suicidologist once said, people die by suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to two: a loss of hope and a loss of social connection. And if the Church of Jesus Christ can't do something about those two things, it should probably just close its doors. My apologies for not capitalizing Jesus. I hope Jesus isn't mad. Yeah, if the Church of Jesus Christ can't do something about those two things, then it should probably just close its doors. And the reality is that the Church of Jesus Christ is actually very well suited to do something about those two things. Hope and social connection are kind of the business that we're in. And so we think that the church has a lot to say about those things, and a lot that it can do to be part of the solution. Another reason that the church should care about this, another way that the church can be a part of this, or kind of making the case for why, is that we also have a real crisis of insufficient access to mental health treatment in America today, particularly in our rural communities. The current statistic is that 72% of communities in the United States have insufficient access to mental health treatment to meet the needs of the people. And this is particularly in rural communities. We know that rural communities that's even a bigger problem in rural communities. So I'll often say to folks, sometimes it's that you don't know who the resources are, and your referral sources or the community resources. Sometimes that's true. And when that's true, you need to learn who they are. You need to get acquainted with the mental health providers in your community. But sometimes it's not an issue of not knowing who they are. It's that they're just not there. And so we've got this gap. Christopher and I actually did a training in rural Arkansas about a couple of years ago. And there was a school police officer in our training. And he said, when we have kids that have meltdowns, I used to take them to the hospital, used to take them to the ER, and the ER would just turn us right back to the school. They would say, we don't have capacity for this. We can't deal with this. So he said, I quit taking them in because the hospital would not accommodate us. And I think that's not uncommon in our rural communities. We also know that in rural communities, clergy people are often the first line of defense. The data shows that people are more inclined to go to their pastor than they are to a physician or to a mental health professional as a first line of defense around these issues. And if you're a clergy person on this call, you know that we're not very well equipped to deal with this in our training. It's a little bit scary when you hear people talk about making referrals and they say, well, we need to refer them to an expert, send them to a therapist, send them to a pastor. Well, therapists and pastors got not that much more training than the rest of the general population about this. So there's a real crisis of insufficient access to treatment, and there's may be no small town in America that doesn't have at least one church. And so we really believe that churches could be anchor points in communities around this. when we think about ways that faith communities can respond to create what we would talk about, what we call webs of safety, we think it's bigger than just, the occasional suicide prevention Sunday. We think it's bigger than just, doing a training in a community. We think that faith communities really can build out their infrastructure in ways that can support those who are thinking about suicide, such as training every member of the church to know what to look for and what to do if someone says that they're thinking about suicide. We kind of talk about a pyramid and say at a minimum, every member of a church should be trained in knowing some of the basic signs. How do you ask the question about suicide? And what do you do if people say yes? But also we think faith communities can normalize the conversation about suicide by just talking about it regularly, talking about it frequently, destigmatizing the idea that people who are thinking about suicide are somehow sick or other or outside of us. So that comes from how we speak from the pulpit. It comes from the materials that we produce. It comes from just making this a much more regular part of the conversation. And Marna's going to talk about that. We can also preach about it and pray about it as a regular part of what we do, not as something that's special or exceptional. I don't remember the number, but I want to say there's 9, 11, 13 passages in the Bible that directly speak to suicide. So there's quite a bit of suicide in the Bible. King Saul died by suicide. One of our favorite stories is the Philippian jailer who almost took his life when he thought Paul and Silas had escaped. There's lots of texts to be used to preach and pray about these things, again, as part of normalizing it. And then we can create cultures where people know how to deal with people who disappoint them and where people aren't shunned or shamed for bad choices. I think this is one of the biggest ones. If multiple contributaries lead to suicidal thinking, and some of those are shame that people feel, we as the church can sometimes be part of that problem and not instead of being part of the solution. So we really believe that faith communities both have work to do in doing all of these things, normalizing these conversations and building out the infrastructure. But we also think that when the Church of Jesus Christ can do something about those two things, we can save lives. So I'll toss it to Marna. You're muted.
And I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm not sure that we need to have the PowerPoint up unless we do.
Not necessarily. Do you want me to take it down?
Yeah, because I feel like I'm talking to this white blob in front of me.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but yeah, there. Now I feel like I'm talking to some people.
Okay.
Yeah, if you have any questions while I'm talking, please put them in the chat. I am Marna Franson. I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, right below Lake Superior, right below Canada. I lived for 25 years in Little Rock, Arkansas, and didn't know Christopher when I was there, but I do now. I was referred to Soul Shop through a friend of mine who worked with AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. When I moved up here, she said, she lived in Little Rock. She said, I just went to this great training for faith-based suicide prevention. You really need to go. So I got myself to a Soul Shop and immediately got hooked, and then went to another one, and then got trained as a trainer, and really have been bugging Christopher and Michelle ever since I started, because I realized a couple of things in that presentation, in the Soul Shop presentation. And let me tell you, I've been to 6 Soul Shops. I've been trained as a trainer, and I'm still learning every time we have a conversation around suicide. Even what Michelle said today, I feel like I learned something today about getting acquainted with the mental health professionals in the community. And I've heard Michelle say that before. And I realized that I haven't had an open house yet in my neighborhood gymnasium for all the pastors in the community and all the mental health professionals. Like, why am I not doing that? That would be a really easy thing to do. And that's suicide prevention, upstream suicide prevention. So in the Soul Shop presentation, what really struck me was the part where we talked about the reasons why people in a congregation do not talk to one another about their suicide ideations, about their lived experience, about their worries about somebody else, about losing somebody to suicide. It's because of the emotional reasons that they have. They feel somehow less than, they feel afraid. We feel, people in our congregation feel shame even though they don't need to. They feel like it's too much for them, so it must be too much for everybody else. They feel like, how dare I burden anybody? They feel like there's all these feelings, and so they don't talk about it. And then, so we turned from that conversation in the training to, so why do all of us who are working in the church, choir directors, Sunday school teachers, priests, pastors, youth leaders, all of them, why are we not asking the question and engaging? And this is what really struck me. It was all those things inside of my head that have held me back came out on that piece of paper. I'm afraid that I don't have enough training. I'm afraid that I'll say the wrong thing and maybe somebody will die because I've said something wrong. I'm afraid that it'll take up too much time and I won't have the time. I'm afraid that if we start talking about suicide, then I'll have this overflow of pastoral needs that I won't be able to meet. There was everything that had been in my head got on that piece of paper. And in that room, all of a sudden I could take a deep breath and feel like, oh, wow, I'm not the only one. And once we started talking about I'm not the only one, then I could see how truly in congregations, in the faith community, we can be instruments to save lives just by destigmatizing the conversation, just by saying, hey, if we're not talking about suicide, that's normal. Nobody wants to talk about suicide. Suicide is not easy to talk about. It's not even easy to say the word. Do you all want to say that word out loud with me? Come on, let's say that word, suicide. Nobody wants to say that word. Just by getting very, very basic about suicide, not wanting to talk about it, how it's stigmatized, kind of opened my mind to what we could do in congregations. So I came back to the congregations I serve. I'm a missioner. I serve 3 congregations plus campus ministry. And I started preaching on suicide. I started preaching about Soul Shop. I started preaching about stigma and shame. And I started making sure that the word suicide came off of my lips very easily. One of the other things we talk about in Soul Shop is a call model, and I'm not going to give away the farm here, but the C for call means to commit, but it's to commit that when we're in trouble, each one of us is in trouble, that we will have people to call. That was another gobsack smack moment for me in the Soul Shop training, because what it did was say, at any moment, I could become overwhelmed by desperation, and I could have suicidal ideations, and I could want to have suicide be my solution to that overwhelm. And when everybody realizes that at any moment, any of us could be in that situation, it takes the conversation from those people over there to all of us here. And that was another thing that I brought back to my communities and said, desperation is what we're talking about here. The other thing that really struck me, and that is kind of the bee under my bonnet, was the idea of hope with skin on, of upstream suicide prevention. Some of the things that Michelle mentioned on her screen about desperation are things that in a community setting we can address. This morning I was thinking about, what do I really want to say here today? Because I've been talking a lot about suicide for a while, and so I have a lot to say. But what I realized was there was a key moment in my life when I was the assistant for families and children at a small church in Arkansas, maybe more than small, a medium-sized church in Arkansas. And I was going through a divorce. And I was telling people. And what I was most surprised at was that nobody shamed me. I didn't realize how much I expected to experience shame for becoming a divorced woman. And when I didn't, that overwhelming sense of love and acceptance came over me. I didn't even know that I was expecting to be shamed. And then a couple of months later, when financial troubles hit, which often do in divorces, one of my colleagues at the church said to me, "We're not going to let you not be able to make your mortgage payment next week." Like they said, and they destigmatized my financial troubles in my faith community. And that saved my life. That saved my desperation. And so we think of shunning as something that may happen to somebody who's done a terrible thing, but for me, it was when I didn't get shunned when a divorce happened. And that, now I realize, lessened my load of desperation. So I came back here to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I started doing three things. I started preaching and praying about suicide prevention. I started talking about Soul Shop with everybody to try to get people on board with this training. And I started going to 2 Suicide Prevention Alliance meetings in my area. Let me tell you this. I appeared at the first meeting and I said, "I don't know anything about suicide prevention, but I've been to this training and I would like to commit myself as a leader in the faith community to attend these meetings." And both of the Suicide Prevention Alliance people said to me, "We have never had a committed faith leader come to our meetings regularly. Never, never." And I thought, well, I can do that. I can show up. And in showing up over the last 2 years, I have built relationships with community allies and community partners. And we got a $5,000 grant from the Marquette County Health Department to bring 2 soul shops to the Upper Peninsula. That's no small investment in the Marquette community. And so that, just seeing that as a result has been amazing. And I just want to tell you 3 more things that have happened concretely out of me talking about suicide. I was sitting at my desk one day, and on my phone, I got a text from a member of my congregation saying, "My wife and I have just walked into my son's bedroom and he has a shotgun and he is about to use it. What do I do?" And I was able to say, "Okay, we got you. I'm so glad you walked into your son's room." And without any pause, without anything, I was able to assess and lead that family to safety. If I hadn't had Soul Shop, I would have been, I don't know what I would have done, right? But I think the reason that they did that and they reached out to me is that I had been talking about suicide and suicide prevention in the congregation. I have a member of one of the congregations I serve who is a co-director and a programmer at the Children's Museum in town. And he said to me, "I have youth that work for me. I have college students that work for me and young adults. And out of the 6 that I have, I'm actively worried about 4 of them and whether or not they're suicidal." And so because of that, we got him to a Soul Shop training, and we began to talk about what can he do with his people, and how can that help. And the other thing that happened with us is that on campus ministry, we've gotten some invitations from the well-being office to come and be a part of the spiritual well-being on campus, because we're willing to talk about these kinds of things openly. So just in 2 years, I can't imagine what is going to happen as we continue to have this conversation, talk about it more openly. I also had a friend of mine who's part of one of the congregations tell me that when they were a child, it looked like their father was desperate. And so she took a bottle of pills that she thought her father had gotten to use to die. and she hid them from her dad. And she said, I still have that bottle of pills. I think maybe I can throw them away because I was able, for the first time in my life, to tell anybody that story. So she was able to release that story that she had been holding since childhood about whether or not her dad was going to try to die. And the relief on her face was amazing. So that's my experience with Soul Shop, and my commitment is to really bring in this tool, this workshop, and then to talk to people about it. I've had a number of people come to more than one of the Soul Shops, and I'm inviting people to come back over and over again. And the word is getting out. It feels like it's been slow, but it's been pretty quick in 2 years, what has happened in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Thank you, Marna.
You're welcome.
Matt.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Holcomb. I'm the rector of St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Colorado Springs, and I'm grateful to be providing a case study and just sharing a little bit about St. Michael's journey over the past several years. Briefly about myself, I have been an Episcopal priest for a dozen years, and in those dozen years, I have done more than a dozen burials for individuals who have died by suicide. And that is from teenagers up to individuals in their 60s. So 3.5 years ago, I was called to St. Michael's. And if you do your math, that was about 6 weeks before the pandemic. And so coming into this community, as many of us are still feeling the waves of the pandemic, there was a lot of trying to get to know this community in the midst of being closed down and trying to do ministry different. But one of the things that we did was we created opportunities for connection. And part of that evolved into providing a month in our parish that we talk about wellness, whether it's spiritual wellness or mental wellness or physical wellness. And so we have just done, if you're doing the math, there's been 3 years where we've been consciously talking about wellness in new ways. And a few things that have bubbled up in the course of that is some clarity about our responsibility as a faith community, and especially the leaders. So if you are a rector, or if you are an associate, or if you are a lay leader that is not ordained, there's a certain responsibility that I do believe those who are leading faith communities have. And so one of the things that happened within the first 6 months is I started finding out who was out there. Who are the therapists that could support St. Michael's? And that may seem like an odd place to start, but what we realized, and what I realized in ministry and working in other faith communities, is that it's really important to have resources available so that when people need them, you can respond. So within the first 6 months here at St. Michael's, I had programmed in my phone the 3 closest mental health hospitals that individuals of all ages could be admitted to if they were having an acute mental health crisis, or they were having suicidal ideations, or they had a plan that I could immediately talk to the parents or that individual and say, okay, here's where you need to go. The second was to, have a group of therapists available that I felt comfortable with referring to for a number of things. And what resulted in that was actually some great partnerships with local therapists and psychologists here in Colorado Springs. And so, several years later, I'm constantly, going back to the same group of individuals and referring them. And as we continue to build these resources, what became very clear is that we needed to make it easy for our community and for our parish to find resources that were curated and trusted from the faith community, because oftentimes people want to know, well, what do you think? I mean, as you heard Michelle talk about, and Marna, that there are professionals in communities that say, go and talk to the priest, go and talk to the church. well, if they're coming our way, how are we responding to that? So I'd love to share my screen with you really quickly. This is our church website that you're seeing on your screen. And if I go up to resources, you're going to see very easily, it's not hidden, that there is a space for mental health. And there is language out there about the importance of mental health and how we are built for connection. And there's recordings that you can watch. We've had panelists and guest speakers come in from our community and be our Sunday adult speaker. And we've recorded those and made those available. And then if someone has help or needs some additional support, there's also resources out here. One of the things that we have done at St. Michael's is we have partnered with David Galvan, who is a committed advocate within our community who is about mental health and help. And in working with David, we determined it really makes sense to have you be our mental health first aid trainer in residence as a resource for our community, for the clergy, for our staff, for lay leaders, that they can go to David and ask the tough questions. And so this website provides you all these resources, but that wasn't enough because there are stigmas still around suicide and asking for help. And so how do we provide resources for those who are on our website? They found themselves at a mental health page and they don't know what to do next, but they know they need help. And so what we did is as a church, we curated some resources. So at the very bottom, if someone were to click on, not that one, but to click on the mental health resources, what they're going to find are resources that are local for our community. And so if you're here in Colorado Springs, there are a number of places that you can go. If you are not in Colorado Springs, but you need help, here are the places that you can call. If you're in Colorado Springs, where are the places that you can walk in and get mental health services? But there's more. So we know that it's not just about suicide, but there may be other things that are contributing factors for someone who may be having suicidal ideations or the thought of it. And so, providing resources for domestic violence, sexual abuse, elder abuse, all of those things. And then how do we help get people connected? And this is what's great. I've seen some of the chat questions, but there are a number of online free resources that therapists will go out and put their information in. By clicking on one of these, you can filter down and say, okay, I'd like someone who is telehealth. I'd like someone who is LGBTQI plus, friendly or inclusive. I need someone who takes Blue Cross. No, wait, I don't want Blue Cross, I want Cigna. And so you click that. And what you're going to end up with is a consolidated list that you'll be able to use and share with others. So when we, as a church, take on the responsibility of doing this work and trying to do it well, it does mean that you're going to have skin in the game, but it also means you're going to have to do some work. This is where our partnership with Soul Shop and some other nonprofit organizations has really been beneficial. David Galvan, as I mentioned, who we've been working with as our mental health first aid trainer in residence, he first brought several years ago mental health first aid training, and it was a great entry level. But one of the things we were missing was the faith component. And so David went out and started working with Michelle and Chris and got trained. And I don't know if this number is correct. Michelle, you have to correct me, but I think David's done like 14 or 15 trainings, soul shops all around the country. And so there are people within the Soul Shop Trainer Network that will travel, that will come to your remote parish or part of the country and provide this training for you. But this is expensive work. And so one of the things that has been a barrier for many people to get the help they need is, how do we pay for this? And so as we wrestled with that within St. Michael's, we started talking about it and how expensive it is for people to get the help they needed. And so someone came up after a sermon and said, I'd like to help in providing therapy for some parishioners. And I was like, okay, I mean, that's very generous, it's expensive. And they said, how about $2,000? And I was like, wow, that would be amazing. So we put that money aside and we started advertising. And we said, if you need help, we will provide you with the help you need. We went through that $2,000 within 2 weeks. We ended up going into the discretionary funds for the clergy and almost depleting those entirely. And then we started talking about it as a parish, we are responding to the needs. And if you have the ability to support getting people the help they need, we'd love to hear from you. And people started making contributions specifically for mental health help within our parish or within friends of our parish. Within the first 14 months of us advertising that we want to help you get the help you need, we spent over $14,000. So on average, $1,000 a month was going. Realizing that it may be difficult to sustain this, we started looking at other resources. And this is one of the things I would invite you to look at and reach out to the leadership within your diocese. In Colorado, we have a unique grant program for residents of Colorado that will help with medical expenses. And I imagine there's other dioceses out there that are going to have something similar. Or maybe you bend your bishop's ear to think about this. What would it look like on a diocesan level, on a high level, for there to be resources set aside for people to get the help they need? Because it's often that acute response. How you respond when someone is in crisis is massively important. In getting tools through Soul Shop, I went to my last Soul Shop training 2 months ago, and you practice asking people for help. Do you have a plan? And then they say no. And then you ask them again, do you have a plan? So there's a lot of things within the parish that you can do. There's still things that we're learning into. There's not a great manual out there that says, check all these boxes and you're never going to have to deal with this. It's a part of all of our communities. It's a part of all of our parishes. If 6%, and we talked about this in staff a couple of weeks ago, if a minimum of 6% of your parish is thinking about suicide, and you have 300 people show up on a Sunday, as we did the week before, there was almost 20 people that we knew of that were thinking about suicide. And that is scary. And that is, I think, a place where the church and faith leaders can hold the tension, as we often look at the Gospels and Jesus holding that tension of those who were not well and asking them, do you want to be made well? And I think our responsibility as a community, as followers of this Jesus movement, is to keep asking that question. Do you want to be made well? And then having the resources to follow up and help people.
Wow. Matt, can I ask you,
please,
who curates that list of resources on your website? I think it's awesome, and I think it's exhausting. That looks like a lot of work.
It is, but the 3 hours, the 4 hours that it took to pull that together,
okay,
it's worth it.
Okay, so it wasn't 4 weeks. It was
no. I mean, and the great thing is, so NAMI, this is another resource that we talk about a lot. If NAMI is new to you, NAMI, go ahead out on the website. I'll see if one of our other panelists can put their link into the chat as I'm talking about it. So this is a national organization, and it provides phenomenal resources for those who are having questions about mental health. And I've referred numerous families to go to the support groups that are often local or regionally to provide support, whether a child has a young adult or a child has suicidal ideations or has mental health, diagnosed mental health, that there's support groups around all of this. So it's one of those things that as you journey into it, and it's a journey, if you think within the next month you're going to have this figured out and have all the resources and tools, you're going about it the wrong way. Go ahead and take a small step. You being a part of this this webinar is a great first step. Or it may be a second step or third step, or you already might be doing some of this stuff. But there's always more you can do. And I am grateful for Joe and EPN because they're able to pull together some great resources around the country so that we can all be leaning into best practices and not making this up on our own. I mean, nothing on that list that you saw that it does feel exhausting. None of it we created. It was just going out and finding it and then connecting people into those resources.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I want to actually answer a few of the questions that I saw in the chat before we go any further. One of the questions I saw two different people ask was about whether or not it could be that men show no markers for mental health issues because they don't seek help. I actually, in the chat, I put the link to the article. I think that my own feeling about that, and what I think I read in the article that was talking about the research, is that there may be some of that men don't seek help. But really, when we think about hopelessness and isolation, it shifts the way we think about this. I sometimes say, like, yeah, sure, you could say that people who died by suicide were depressed, but we're definitely talking about situational depression, not sort of biochemical depression. If I've just lost my job and I'm filing for bankruptcy and I'm going through a divorce and I'm facing foreclosure and my children won't speak to me, sure, I'm going to have some of the symptoms of depression too, but it's not a mental health issue. It's a life situation issue. And what we find, so my own personal thing, I mean, Chris tells this story all the time. If I meet a middle-aged white man who is going through a divorce, I don't need to know a single other thing about them. I ask them if they're thinking about suicide. I have asked people if they're thinking about suicide whose name I didn't know, because it is so common to meet middle-aged white men going through divorces who are thinking about suicide. It's the issues around identity. I'm starting to face age discrimination in my job. I'm financially not where I need to be. I can't provide for my family. I don't mean to say that those men, that suicide isn't related to mental wellness or mental health at all. I don't mean to say that. What I do mean to say is we can get inaccurately myopic in our perspective when we pigeonhole these things into mental health issues. Men have higher suicide rates because they have higher access to firearms. They use more lethal means. And when I looked for the article, I just reread it again, and it said that men who showed fewer markers for psychiatric issues also died with firearms at a higher rate. So there's this kind of level of distress with lethal means, impulsive action, feeling trapped, and then they end their life. Women attempt suicide more often, but men die by suicide more often because they use more lethal means. And so those are complex matrices. And I don't think it's just because it looks like they don't seek mental health help. Yeah. Somebody asked the question. Oh yeah, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in because I saw the question, a couple of questions about 988.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great resource initially, and you can look at statistics online about initially when they launched, they were just massively overwhelmed, and some of the response times were a little too long, and it's gotten better. But one of the things when you're in a relationship with someone and you identify that there may be a concern about their mental health or that they may be thinking about suicide, saying, hey, call this national number for help. It's a great resource, but don't let it be the only tool in your toolbox. Your toolbox needs to have other things like, hey, do you have a plan? And if you hear a plan, where are you? I'd like to come pick you up and take you to the hospital. I mean, those are the kinds of things that are sometimes needed, those interventions. And so, yes, we will update our Q&A or our resource guide with 988, but it shouldn't be the only thing you have.
Yeah.
Just my comments.
And
Yeah.
I just want to jump in, and I know Christopher, you have to go, say what you're going to say, but I want to give another plug for upstream suicide prevention, which is before the desperation happens. We can begin to educate men in our community and say, if you are a middle-aged man and it's very possible that could push you to desperation. This is what desperation looks like. You might want to get a lock for your firearms or give us your thing. Like, we can educate people before they get to desperation so that they might begin to ask for help. If we begin to do the information we do here out in public, that's upstream suicide prevention before it gets to the crisis point where you're having people on the phone with a plan.
Yeah. The other thing about 988, just to kind of inform people, it is a national number, but 988 is answered locally. So it goes national and then it routes back to local resources. So I agree with Matt, having a person in your church that they can go talk to. I worship with this person on a regular basis, and now I've got somebody right here I can talk to is always better than having to pick up the phone and call a crisis line. But the crisis line is routed back to local resources. So it's a really good stopgap. Different communities have better and worse, Chris, different communities are funded differently. Is that right? Yeah. So different communities do better and are doing better, but stick with it, because I think they're working pretty hard to get better at it. I also had somebody asked a question. I answered it, but I want to say it here. Somebody asked if a legacy of suicide is a risk for suicide. I assume what it means is if you've lost someone to suicide, is that a risk factor? And the answer is yes, it is a risk factor. Suicide loss survivors have lifelong higher risk for suicide. So do people who have lived experience of suicidality. So those are two groups that among us that have significantly increased risk for the rest of their life. And that is important. That's important information, because you've got risk kind of under your nose and the ability to care for folks who are both struggling and suffering and grieving and living with a kind of lifelong loss, but also have higher risk of suicide. So, good. Chris, you want to take it?
Yeah, pop my screen up there if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
So just a little bit more about Soul Shop. We are dedicated to, we're a faith-based organization dedicated to suicide prevention, really training clergy, pastors across the United States. A lot of times they're the first defense. We come in as a public health approach to this. We realize that often it's not necessarily the lifeguard that actually pulls somebody out of the water. It's actually somebody right there next to the water that actually sees what's going on. We feel the same thing about suicide in regards to that, knowing that our faith communities do play a big part of this and that we are connected across the board. But just a few things here about what Soul Shop is, what we do, that kind of thing. Of course, we train clergy, we train faith leaders, what to see, what to do, how to, feel more comfortable around suicide, having these very intense, understanding kind of conversations. These are some of our products. These are some of the workshops that we do. Soul Shop for Leaders is actually an umbrella program, kind of covers all faith communities across the board. Each of these are 8-hour programs, basically kind of giving everybody more of a comfortability, what to watch for, that kind of thing. Soul Shop for youth workers. So sometimes you'll see Soul Shop for youth leaders. This is actually specific for junior high schoolers. The specific warning signs, things to be looking for, how to have those conversations. Of course, bringing in the community at large, but also the parents. Parents do play a big part of this conversation. We want to make sure we kind of bring them in. So this is for your youth pastors within the church itself. Soul Shop for campus ministries or for our universities and colleges. We have Soul Shop for Black churches, which we partnered with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention to kind of create this program for the uniqueness around suicide within the Black community. We do see a rise in suicide over this last year that we're kind of worried about. We're really kind of paying attention to it and seeing if we can kind of maybe make some marks here. Soul Shop for Hispanic communities or Hispanic churches is going to be coming out hopefully January 2024. Again, making sure that there's some cultural competencies around the program itself, spoken in Spanish, that kind of thing. We do have within all those programs that I just mentioned, we do have a curriculum for churches. So once you've gone through the program, it's the 8-hour program, as an attendee for that program, we have curriculum for you to take back to your churches, your parishes, to be able to really start to make some difference and some movement within the church itself. And those are about an hour to an hour and 30 minutes program. We give you the script, we give you the PowerPoints, we give you everything that you need in regards to making sure that you have good information. The only other thing about the youth, we are finishing that up. That's actually, we're kind of dividing that up to where there's an 8-week program for Sunday school, possibly. We have a 4-week program or even just a weekend retreat in that. There's some letters to parents, being able to have a conversation with them before actually bringing this into the church, that kind of thing, just for safety reasons, that kind of thing. Soul Shop for Communities is basically our program, Ripped of Faith, so that it's kind of outwardly facing to the community, kind of inviting them into this conversation around that, around suicide. And then last but not least here, we have ASSIST, which is Applied Suicide Intervention Training for Faith Communities. This is a 2-day program. This is a pretty intense program that we kind of provide for faith communities and giving them like the upper end tool of suicide prevention or even any kind of distress. And then, of course, you heard Matt talk about mental health first aid. We do have trainers within our network that actually can provide that in adult and also in youth. So if you want more information, you'll see right there, it's at soulshopmovement.org, or either me or Michelle. You can, our email addresses are pretty easy. It's either Michelle at soulshopmovement.org or Christopher at soulshopmovement.org. Thank you.
And I'd like to say, like, you know, that this is not meant to be a giant sales pitch. In fact, I think a lot of the stuff that Matt said is separate from Soul Shop, not Soul Shop. Soul Shop is just one avenue for doing this or thinking about this. But one of the things I would say in terms of churches being involved in this work is that Soul Shop is the only approved provider of faith-based suicide prevention training through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And there are American Foundation for Suicide Prevention chapters in every single state in the country. And they are, just to be honest, incredibly well-funded. What they don't have very often is faith community partners. And so Soul Shop does cost something to bring, but oftentimes what we've got are AFSP chapters with money in communities wanting to do trainings, but no contacts, no entry points into the faith communities. And so in some ways, collaboration around a Soul Shop isn't even about a sell. It's about you saying to us or to the AFSP chapter or to the NAMI chapter or to the whatever, all these entities that really understand faith communities as a central player in this fight against suicide and mental health in their communities, but they can't do it without insiders in the church, and they don't know how to get there. So I think that's another way of thank you. I think it's another way of saying a role that the churches can play is just being willing to collaborate with your secular community partners that are out there who are doing the work. So yeah, as Chris said, we're happy to have any of those conversations that you would ever want to have with us.
There was a question here, and I do kind of want to address this because there was a question about mass shootings and suicide, and there's just not been a lot of research on that. The researchers that do a lot of work in mass shootings, they have come down to understand that they need to understand suicide prevention. They realize that shooters that go into a situation like that often go in with the idea that they will not come out, which is a suicidal kind of concept in regards to looking at that. So there's a lot of research in regards to that. So stay tuned, that kind of thing. There will be some more stuff that kind of pops out around that, but it's a little bit different than, what we're kind of talking about here. But
yeah. Okay, Joe, I think we're at the end. I think it's 4:00 on the nose.
Hey, yeah, and in the chat, there's a whole bunch for Michelle and Christopher, there's a whole bunch of questions about like cost and approximate, and I would just reiterate what they've already said. In October, we have a soul shop coming back to St. Michael's for all of our vestry and parish leaders and staff members, and it will be nothing. Even the lunch is being provided. And so I think if there's any interest whatsoever, don't let cost be a factor of how this could change and save one life.
Yeah.
Because of the soul shop, we have a new priest came into my office and said, I was talking to a parishioner, and in the last 2 of the 3 nights, she has had suicidal thoughts. And I said, great, did you ask her if she has a plan? And she goes, no. And I'm like, that's something I learned at Soul Shop, and you're going to be coming to the next one in October. And so even, you can't put a price on this. And often there is no price tag. So I don't know if that helps, yeah. Michelle and Christopher, but just have to plug it.
Thank you, Matt. I'm happy to answer the question, but it is a complex question. So it's a couple $1,000s to do a soul shop if you were doing it by yourself and you were going to write a check. But the reason that it's a complicated question is because we have community partners. We know how to help you get sponsors. Sometimes people charge participant fees. We train trainers, so you could become a trainer and then you could provide it in your community. So becoming a trainer has a price tag, but then you can charge for it. So it's, but a couple $1,000s is what a soul shop costs. As Matt said, lots of ways to get that paid for.
Yeah. And also, if you would like to attend a soul shop, and you can go out to our website. We keep that website pretty updated in regards to upcoming events. So soulshopmovement.org/upcoming. You will find maybe a soul shop that's close by that you can kind of attend.
Yeah.
And if you want to come to a pilgrimage soul shop, it's not easy to get there, but it's gorgeous in the summer. Come August 30th. Christopher will be there, and we're going to have a bonfire afterwards for those that come from far away. So come and have fun.
Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Matt,
Michigan. Yeah.
Matt, there was a question in the chat about whether or not you'll make your curated list of resources available.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, we definitely can. I'll share that with Joe. So when an email goes out to those who are registered, they'll have some of those resources on them. That's not a problem.
Marna, somebody said, do we get to be called Youpers?
Yes, you do. You can be a Youper for a weekend. Absolutely. I'll even buy you a button that says
Oh, I love it.
All right, Joe.
Hey, Michelle, would it be possible, just as our time comes to an end, to close in a prayer?
Could you please?
All right, absolutely. Yeah. The Lord be with all of you, and let us pray. Gracious and almighty God, we thank you for the gift of this time with one another and for the use of technology. We ask that you keep us mindful of the needs of others and especially attentive to the stories of their lives. We pray for all those this day who are lonely, anxious, or thinking about self-harm. We pray for the doctors and nurses who have been called to the mental health field to help all of those in need. Help each of us and strengthen us to do our part in making your name not only known, but also for a sense of helping others be well. We bless all those who are doing this difficult work and strengthen them in the days ahead. And all this we pray in your most holy name. Amen.
Amen.